Hi there. In this video, we're going to have a discussion about how confidence intervals can be used and in what applications they might be especially useful for. As you may already know, in statistics, we take samples because oftentimes it's either impossible or just impractical to have population data or acquire population data. Confidence intervals can be used as an inference tool to learn about a population without actually having data for that population. So for example, if you conducted a survey of Delaware Tech students, you could use that information to make inferences about all Delaware Tech students. Similarly, if you conducted a survey throughout the whole US about a student's experience in college, then you could use that to infer about the population of all students who have been in college. Confidence intervals can be a very powerful tool. Gives us, in some ways, kind of an acceptable threshold if you're thinking about this from a manufacturing standpoint. You can almost decide, at what point would you say that something's being underfilled or overfilled. Pretty much you name it, there's probably a use for confidence intervals with it. Now, something I like to do with my students is ask them to come up with ideas. So I'm going to go ahead and share some ideas with you that my students have given me as topics, and then we'll get into what you might use a confidence interval for. One of my students asked about movies. So how could we relate this to movies? I've also had students ask about sports scores, so specifically basketball, but you could also look at this really for any sport. You can also look at this for satisfaction ratings. So if you were, let's say, curious about maybe you own a business and you're curious how your customers are responding to the way that you run your business, right? You could conduct a survey of some customers to find out if they're happy with your services and then move on from there to see, does this tell you overall? Because it just wouldn't be practical for you to ask every single customer that same question. From the perspective of like allied health and sciences, confidence intervals are used very heavily in much of the research that's done. So if you've ever explored journal articles, you may have already seen confidence intervals. Sometimes they don't necessarily call it that, but there's indications that they are talking about confidence intervals. And as an example, if let's say you were maybe conducting clinical trials, right? So if you were doing clinical trials there, there's no way that you could release this out to the general public. So there might be confidence intervals constructed to show how much change there's been either over time. So if you're looking at like before or after, you could use a 2-sample confidence interval in that capacity. But you name it, there really are many ways that confidence intervals can be used. So I'm going to make one more note here, also with allied health. Pretty much anything healthcare related has to go through testing. So if it's something that they're trying to release to the general public, you see these very, very often. I want to circle back for a moment here to the movie example. One of my students had asked a few semesters ago, well, how could we relate confidence intervals to movies? That's a great question. It depends on what route you want to go. If you look at it from maybe what the production costs are, you could take a sample of movies that were produced within the last 5 years. Maybe you're curious how much money and funding, so you conduct a survey of movies that would be similar in genre to yours. And then you could determine, okay, this is kind of the ballpark of what we should expect to be spending for that movie. So again, making inferences from a sample of data. As far as basketball or really any sport goes, if you're curious how whether it's a single team, a single player, or even an entire league of players, you could use that to see if there has been maybe change over time. So for example, maybe someone's curious to see, is there a difference between how many free throws basketball players had in the 80s versus how many free throws they get now in the 2020s, right? So you could use, again, in that case, that would be a 2-sample confidence interval. In the next video, we're also going to have the same discussion about how you can use pretty much any topic to relate to hypothesis testing. So we'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.